Imagine living in a world where marriage ceremonies turned into public spectacles, animals stood trial, and medical treatments involved burning, scraping, or crushing. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when people's ideas about justice, health, and even romance would make most of us do a double take today. Join us today as we tell you about some of the weirdest traditions you wouldn't believe existed in medieval times. 1. Waking up to work or socialize in the middle of the night. Imagine going to bed right after the sun sets, sleeping for a few hours, waking up in the middle of the night to hang out with family or take care of chores, and then going back to bed until morning. This segmented sleep pattern was the norm in medieval Europe, where a straight 8 hours of sleep was unheard of. Instead, people split their nights into 2 distinct phases, with an intermission in the middle. This break allowed folks to wake up, have a snack or a drink, chat with family, or even take care of household tasks before settling back in for the second sleep. Researchers call this pattern biphasic sleep. The first period started soon after nightfall, aligning naturally with our body's inclination to rest as darkness falls. After a few hours, people would wake up for an hour or two, and then head back to bed for the second round of rest, finishing up around sunrise. Medieval records even mention warm drinks, nighttime rituals, and activities like making water, a polite reference to restroom visits. These early hours were embraced as a time for quiet reflection or minor tasks, fitting perfectly with the natural rhythms of body and mind, which often become alert after a few hours of initial sleep. Then, with sunrise, the day began anew, leaving behind the memory of this communal 2-part night. 2. Medieval bedding ceremonies. In the world of medieval Europe, wedding nights were a lot more public than you'd expect. Couples back then didn't just have their wedding night in private, their loved ones, and sometimes the whole community, gathered to witness the start of their married life up close. This ancient custom, known as the bedding ceremony, was all about bringing friends and family right into the mix, symbolizing that the couple's new union was fully embraced by the community. The ceremony itself was as lively as a wedding reception, with a priest blessing the bed and the couple sipping on wine. Bridesmaids and groomsmen tossed the couple's stockings at them for good luck, believing that if you hit the couple with the stocking, you were destined to marry soon. As the ritual wrapped up, the bed curtains would be drawn, allowing the couple a semblance of privacy, though some historians suggest the consummation might still have had a few witnesses, especially if the couple was of royal blood. Royals like Catherine of Aragon were famously subjected to this tradition, with the entire room packed with onlookers cheering on the union. By the 17th century, however, the bedding tradition started to fade. King Charles III of England, for example, put his foot down, refusing to take part in the custom, even with some royals, like William III and Mary the Sioux, still indulging in the ceremony after being egged on by family members. Bedding ceremonies were becoming rare and finally fell out of favor as times changed. 3. Animal trials and executions. The medieval judicial system held a fascinating and strange view on crime. It was totally fine to put animals on trial. Yep, from goats to pigs, animals were called into court, held responsible for various offenses, and even had their own defense attorneys. In cases that sound almost absurd to modern ears, animals like unruly rats were even sent polite notices to vacate homes and other premises they'd overrun. One notorious case unfolded in Savigny, France, in 1457 when a sow and her piglets were accused of taking the life of a young child. The scene became a full-blown legal affair, complete with prosecutors, 8 witnesses, a judge, and a lawyer for the soul. After hearing testimonies and examining the evidence, and yes, bloodstains were considered, the court condemned the mother pig. The piglets, however, were let off the hook since they were too young to understand their actions. The convicted sow was then hanged from a makeshift gallows, showcasing just how serious medieval communities were about their strange brand of justice. These animal trials, as strange as they sound, were actually rooted in religious beliefs. People believed they were following a divine command to ensure everything on earth followed a moral code. Animals, in their view, weren't exempt. The idea was to uphold an almost sacred order and control over every creature. Thankfully, today's courts stick to humans, and these bizarre proceedings have long been relegated to history's oddities. 4. Medieval food and delicacies. The medieval diet is a far cry from today's cuisine, and most of it would shock modern appetites. European dishes of the time included beaver tails, roasted cats, and wriggling lampreys, things that would surely spark outrage today. It wasn't all strange, though. Their meals consisted largely of bread, veggies, and some meat, resembling a balanced diet. But when it came to certain recipes, Medieval Europeans got downright adventurous. Bread was a staple, as were pretzels, which were a popular snack. They'd even wrap meat in dough and bake it, creating an early form of our beloved meat pie. But many didn't have the luxury of indulging in such fare. For those observing religious fasts or living in poverty, strange foods became the norm. Christianity heavily influenced medieval eating habits, with people fasting for 40 days during Lent and abstaining from animal products several days each week. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were typically fasting days, each honoring a different Christian figure or event, and pushing followers to find creative ways to honor their faith. To keep to these dietary rules, medieval folks embraced bizarre substitutes, including creatures that seemed to bend the rules. Beaver tails and barnacle geese, which were considered aquatic animals due to their unique characteristics, were fair game on fast days. Similarly, while coastal communities could enjoy fresh seafood, inland towns weren't so lucky and relied on preserved, often rancid fish like herring and cod. Such meals were often chased with ale or wine to make them more bearable. And superstitions even led some to cook cats, wrongly associated with dark forces, as a meal. Luckily, by the 16th century, the Reformation helped lift many of these restrictions, giving people freedom to enjoy whatever foods they chose, even on Fridays. With that, a long chapter of odd, faith-driven culinary choices began to close, and medieval diners could finally eat freely. 5. Married couples could divorce by combat. If you think modern divorce battles are rough, medieval divorce by combat took things to another level. German fencing master Hans Talhofer's 1467 manuscript, Fechtbuch, or Fencing Book, gives a brutal account of spousal duels that doubled as divorce proceedings. Divorce by combat wasn't just about heated arguments. It was about a literal fight to the finish, as Talhofer vividly detailed. According to Talhofer, a husband would be buried up to his waist in a 3-foot-wide hole with one hand tied behind his back. His wife, on the other hand, was armed with 3 rocks wrapped in cloth, each weighing between 1 and 5 pounds. The husband, restricted to the hole, could defend himself with only one arm, while the wife freely circled the pit, armed and ready to strike. Rules of the duel were strict. If the man touched the edge of the pit, he had to surrender one of his clubs to the judges. If the woman hit him with a rock during this breach, she'd forfeit one of her stones. Essentially, it was a deadly tug of war with very high stakes and limited weapons. These medieval duels were both strange and brutal, revealing much about gender roles of the time. The man's restrictions suggest an attempt to level the playing field between the physically stronger husband and his wife. Still, neither participant got off easy, as the battle typically continued until one gave up, or worse, was seriously injured or even lost their life. Historians long knew of trial by combat, where accused individuals could opt for a fight to decide their guilt or innocence. But this spousal combat scenario is a more recent discovery, thanks to Talhofer's illustrated manuscripts, unearthed by University of Oklahoma Professor Kenneth Hodges. These brutal divorce fights, mostly documented in medieval Germany, began to disappear after the early 13th century. But they give us a vivid glimpse into how disputes were handled and settled in ways unfathomable today. 6. Fabulous men's fashion. Fashion was a big deal for the upper crust in medieval Europe. Clothes weren't just to keep warm, they were status symbols. The wealthier you were, the more extravagant your outfit. And this was especially true for men's fashion, which had its fair share of bizarre trends. Take those pointy shoes, for instance. According to Pam Crabtree's Encyclopedia of Society and Culture in the Medieval World, men's shoes started getting longer and pointier, as the length of your shoes was practically a ruler for your social rank. The wealthiest wore such ridiculously long shoes that they had to reinforce the toes with whalebone to keep them upright. Talk about taking fashion over function to new extremes. The late 14th century saw men going for daring, almost scandalous attire with their super short tunics and tights. And let's not forget the codpiece, a very in-your-face accessory that left little to the imagination. This pouch, padded and proudly displayed on the front of men's trousers, was an exaggerated statement of masculinity. As if clothing style wasn't enough, there were strict laws dictating who could wear what. These sumptuary laws laid out all kinds of limits on colors, fabrics, and even the types of hats people could don, depending on their status or job. Such rules were part of a bigger moral push to keep everyone in their lane, especially when it came to luxury items like velvet and dyed fabrics. Only the nobility could wear expensive materials like velvet, and if you saw anyone sporting purple, you could bet they had a royal connection. Even the colors of one's wardrobe were controlled. Scarlet was a luxury, and purple. That was practically off limits unless you were royalty. This color-coded clothing system kept everyone aware of their rank and reduced spending on imported goods, keeping the focus on local, more moral spending. 7. Burned cats for fun. While ancient Egyptians practically worshipped cats, medieval Europe was a whole different story. Cats had a bit of an image problem back then. They were seen as satanic creatures, often linked to witchcraft. While dogs happily took on roles as loyal protectors or hunters, cats' independent, sneaky nature didn't sit well with superstitious Europeans. They seemed too mysterious, too hard to control, and that made people nervous. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX made things official by declaring cats as devilish creatures in his decree, Vox in Rama. He claimed Satan himself often took on the form of a cat, and there were wild tales of devil worshippers kissing a cat's rear end in satanic rituals. This strange belief gained momentum, adding fuel to the fire of Europe's growing fear of cats. Edward, Duke of York, famously said in the 1400s that if any creature had the spirit of the devil in it, it was most certainly the cat. With statements like these, cats became the unfortunate targets of many European communities. Then came the bubonic plague in the 14th century, and people were desperate for someone, or something, to blame. Since cats often roamed the streets and were seen near trash, close to the real culprits, which were actually just infected rats, they were unfairly accused of spreading the disease. By the 15th century, under Pope Innocent VIII, cat hunts became almost ritualistic, a staple of the witch hunts and devil purging in Europe. In cities like Paris, people were known to stuff sacks with cats and throw them onto bonfires, while in places like Saint-Chamond, townsfolk enjoyed chasing flaming cats through the streets. This gruesome entertainment saw no end for centuries, as cats were burned, hurt, or tossed from towers in places like Denmark and Belgium. Thankfully, by the 1800s, animal cruelty laws were introduced, finally putting an end to this widespread torment. 8. The groom of the stool. If you think you've had bad jobs, spare a thought for the medieval groom of the stool. This was a role that, on paper, sounds less than glamorous, but oddly enough, it was one of the most sought-after jobs in a king's court. The groom's primary duty? Managing the king's portable toilet and keeping a close record of his bowel movements. But before you pity the poor soul, know that this role came with perks that were almost royal in themselves. For one, the groom of the stool spent a lot of time with the king, up close and personal. This daily interaction turned the groom into a trusted confidant, someone who could influence the king's decisions and whisper their thoughts into his ear. In fact, as they became trusted advisors, grooms of the stool gained access to some pretty juicy secrets and high-level information that most could only dream of. This job's importance grew even further during the Tudor period in the 1500s. The fashion of the day was opulent and complicated, with kings needing help just to get undressed for, well, nature's call. Back then, a toilet was just a simple wooden block with a hole in it, often with a fabric-covered seat for added luxury. Historians still debate whether the groom merely handed the king a cloth, or went a step further in assisting, but one thing's for sure. This role was powerful. Grooms were usually picked from well-off families and received privileges that would make a nobleman envious. With influence over the king and insight into the palace's inner workings, grooms could suggest policies, ask for favors, and even receive gifts from those seeking the king's favor. Henry VIII's groom, William Compton, was rewarded handsomely with land, leases, and a salary equivalent to a top noble's. The role became so integral to the monarchy that it eventually transformed into a more administrative position, running much of the kingdom's affairs from the royal privy chamber. 9. Shotgun weddings. Forget the idea of romance in medieval upper-class marriages. For the most part, it was all about securing political or social alliances. According to Connor McCarthy's Marriage in Medieval England, love had little to do with it. Women especially had almost no say in the arrangement. Once they reached puberty, around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, marriage became an option. Now, if you're picturing a big white wedding ceremony, think again. Back then, there was no formal event. Marriage could happen anywhere, and it was often as simple as a quick exchange of vows. You might find couples marrying on the street, in a tavern, or even in bed. Proving a marriage was tricky, which led to the church declaring it a holy sacrament in the 12th century, with God's witness required. Once the vows were said, it wasn't over. To truly seal the deal, upper-class couples had to consummate the marriage publicly to confirm the union, but more on that later. 10. The horrifying practice of trepanation. Trepanation sounds like something out of a horror movie, but this real-life medieval practice was a serious medical procedure. Named after the Latin word trepanum, meaning borer, trepanation involved drilling a hole in the patient's skull. Medieval doctors believed this would relieve ailments ranging from headaches to seizures by giving the brain fresh air. Doctors didn't have anything resembling modern medical equipment. Instead, they made do with whatever was available, from stones and wooden tools to metal drills. They shaved part of the patient's head, then used their crude tools to expose the membrane covering the brain. Interestingly, trepanation wasn't unique to medieval Europe. In fact, Dr. Miguel A. Faria Jr. from Surgical Neurology International claims it might have been one of humanity's earliest medical practices. Skulls with these telltale holes have been found all over the world, from ancient Greece to South America. In the 1860s, American diplomat E.G. Squire stumbled upon a trepan skull in Peru, showing signs of healing, which proved the patient had survived. This discovery led researchers to find examples of trepanation worldwide. From relieving pressure after head injuries to supposed cures for demonic possession, trepanation had a storied, if misguided, history. Though many procedures were successful, a fair number failed to rid people of demons, or whatever other ailments medieval doctors hoped to cure. 11. Hairless faces. In today's world, women often go out of their way to enhance their eyelashes. In the Middle Ages, however, a completely different look was in style. According to Margaret Schaus in Women and Gender in Medieval Europe, beauty was all about showcasing a high, rounded forehead. To achieve this look, women would go to rather extreme lengths, removing their eyebrows and even their eyelashes. Some women took it further, plucking their hairline back to create a perfectly oval-shaped, hairless forehead. In a time when a person's face was their main visual asset, this intense grooming process showed serious commitment to fashion and beauty ideals. 12. The Feast of Fools. Every January, medieval Europeans took part in one of the most unique festivals of the year, the Feast of Fools. Inspired by the Roman festival Saturnalia, this celebration was all about flipping the social hierarchy on its head, as described in Sacred Folly, A New History of the Feast of Fools by Max Harris. The powerful and lowly swapped roles. Maids became mistresses, and the king of misrule presided over the chaos. Though the festival started in churches, it quickly spread beyond church walls. Commoners joined in, turning it into a wild event with parades, costumes, comedy, and a whole lot of drinking. Cross-dressing and bawdy songs were a common sight, as people pushed the limits of what was acceptable. As if that wasn't enough, there was also the Festival of the Ass. During this event, a young girl carrying a child would ride a donkey into the church, and to top it off, the congregation would replace Amen with Hee-Haw throughout the service. For a festival so outrageous, it's surprising that the Feast of Fools lasted as long as it did. But over time, church leaders tightened the rules, banning more and more behaviors. Finally, the Protestant Reformation brought an end to all the fun, with the festival condemned as excessive and immoral. 13. Hemorrhoids were burned off with hot irons. Back in the Middle Ages, medical knowledge wasn't exactly what we'd call advanced, and patients often endured some downright brutal treatments. While today we might reach for a tube of cream, medieval folks suffering from hemorrhoids faced much more intense methods. In those days, doctors weren't just battling mysterious illnesses like epilepsy, which they blamed on the devil, but also everyday issues like hemorrhoids. If you had hemorrhoids in the Middle Ages, let's just say the treatment would make you wince. Without the luxury of anesthesia or refined medical tools, physicians grabbed glowing hot pieces of iron and cauterized the hemorrhoids right off. And for an added cringe factor, if hot iron wasn't handy, some doctors resorted to using their fingernails to scrape off the swollen veins. This wasn't for the faint of heart. Hemorrhoids were so common that sufferers even had a nickname, Saint Fiacre's Curse, after the saint believed to protect those afflicted. Legend has it, Saint Fiacre himself once suffered from hemorrhoids and was cured by sitting on a stone. Inspired by this, medieval doctors advised their patients to try the same method. For those whose symptoms didn't magically disappear, there were other solutions. Doctors would have patients sit on rocks while praying, supposedly following in the footsteps of Saint Fiacre. Rumor has it that this miracle rock still exists in his garden to this day. But when that didn't work, doctors moved on to more intense measures, like inserting heated irons to burn the problem away. The less fortunate patients got the fingernail scraping, a suggestion that stemmed all the way from ancient Greek medical texts. While these procedures did eventually get rid of the hemorrhoids, it wasn't without immense pain, proving that medieval medicine was far from gentle. 14. Execution method of being pressed to your demise. For criminals back then, refusing to plead guilty or innocent could lead to one terrifying end: being pressed to the point of losing your life. While execution by crushing had existed for thousands of years, medieval Europe made it a notorious method, usually saved for the most stubbornly silent criminals. The process was simple, but horrific. The accused would be tied down, then slowly crushed under an ever-increasing pile of stones. Unlike some places in ancient Asia that used elephants to do the job, Europeans opted for slabs of stone. In Britain, pressing was typically used to torture criminals into entering a plea. If the person remained silent, the weight would build, pressing harder and harder against the chest, until it became impossible to breathe. The immense pressure often broke bones, and in the worst cases, bones would tear through the skin. One of the most infamous cases of pressing in history happened during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Giles Corey, a farmer from Danvers, Massachusetts, was accused by several women of practicing witchcraft and tormenting them in spectral form. When brought to trial, Corey refused to plead either way, likely hoping to prevent his land from being seized. As punishment, he was forced to lie face up on the ground, a wooden board placed on his chest, and heavy rocks piled on top of him. The sheriff kept adding weight over 3 agonizing days, but Corey's response remained defiant. His famous last words were said to be, "More weight." He passed away on September 19th, 1692. In England, pressing was finally outlawed in 1772. As Enlightenment ideas spread, and people began to rethink such brutal methods, the new era brought calls for more humane punishments, marking the end of an age when the law was sometimes as merciless as the crimes it aimed to punish. Which of these insane traditions shocked you the most? Which ones do you think should still have been a thing? Let us know in the comments.